to whatever position feels most comfortable, allowing the surface beneath you to fully support you. Let go of all your tension. Take a slow breath in and gently let it go. And again, breathing in and out. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be. This is simply a quiet space, a slow moment, just for rest. You may notice your thoughts beginning to slow, like distant sounds fading into the background. Your shoulders soften, your jaw relaxes, your breathing becomes slower, steadier, more relaxed with each breath. If you'd like this story to continue gently through the night, you can set the video to loop. Now, allow the day to drift a little further away. Let your thoughts slow down, and let yourself drift, and follow the calm, steady rhythm of another time. I think you're ready now. Let's begin. Now is the time to ease into tonight's journey together. Picture a front porch on a warm evening somewhere in the hills of Tennessee. The sun's gone down behind the trees, but it hasn't gotten dark yet. That soft, golden, in-between light is sitting on everything. On the wood railings, on the mason jar somebody left on the step, on the dust still hanging in the air from the road. Someone is sitting in a rocking chair, not making a big deal of it, just playing. A fiddle, probably, or maybe a banjo. Something with strings, something that sings back at you when you play it right. No sheet music, no amplifier, nothing fancy. Just a sound that's been living in these mountains for so long, it might as well have grown here alongside the oak trees and the sourwood and the coal dust. That's where this whole thing starts. Not in a recording studio, not in a boardroom, not on a stage. On a porch in the hills, played by someone who probably didn't think they were doing anything particularly historic. They were just playing what they knew. Welcome to tonight's journey. We're going to spend the next few hours following the most American of music from its very earliest roots. A tangle of Scottish fiddle tunes, West African banjos, Irish ballads, and gospel harmonies all sloshing together in the hollows and the farmlands of the rural South. All the way through to the thunderous stadium shows and streaming playlists of the modern era. We're going to talk about why it sounds the way it sounds. We're going to talk about why it makes people feel things. And we're going to talk about every twist and fight and reinvention along the way. The term country and Western music was officially adopted by the recording industry in 1949 to replace the previous label that had been used since the 1920s, which was hillbilly music. That phrase, hillbilly music, tells you a lot about how the world originally perceived this genre. It was working-class music made by people living in rural, often economically precarious circumstances, people who the rest of the country hadn't paid much attention to until a microphone showed up and someone decided to start recording them. The word hillbilly was meant to be dismissive. The music turned out to be anything but country music. And we'll use that term as our main shorthand, even though the full, glorious name country and western has a lot more swagger to it. Grew from multiple overlapping traditions that didn't arrive neatly packaged and labeled. They blended across communities, across kitchen tables and church revivals and barn dances and crossroads, long before anyone gave the result a genre name. Appalachian folk ballads brought to America by Scots-Irish settlers who had preserved them through oral tradition across generations. Southern gospel hymns with their rich harmonics and vocabulary of faith and redemption and the sweet release of a burden finally set down. The blues, born in the Mississippi Delta and shaped by the African-American experience. With its deeply felt emotional directness, its willingness to look at pain without looking away. And cowboy songs from the wide, flat, searingly honest landscape of the American West, songs about open space and solitude and the working life of the frontier. None of those were separate streams that politely merged at some designated meeting point. They mix together the way everything mixes in a country that is still figuring out what it is, messily and organically, and with more beauty than anyone planned. Let's go back even further, because to understand country music, you have to understand the specific human beings who first made it and the world they were living in. And that world started in the Appalachian Mountains. The Scots-Irish settlers who came to the Appalachian highlands of Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky in the late 17th and 18th centuries brought with them the musical traditions of Scotland and Ireland in the only way they could, in their heads and in their hands. There was no recorded music. There were no music stores in the hollows. There was oral tradition. Songs passed down through families the way recipes and land knowledge were passed down, from voice to voice, from fiddle player to fiddle player, generation to generation. English folk songs, Irish jigs, Scottish reels, modal ballads that were already centuries old when they crossed the Atlantic, songs about betrayal and sorrow in the sea and people long dead, still being sung in the Appalachian Mountains as late as 1917, when a folklorist named Cecil Sharp came to document them and was astonished to find melodies he recognized from Britain, preserved in these hills, like flies in amber. The fiddle was the central instrument of this tradition. Not the violin, or rather, the same physical instrument but played with a completely different relationship. Classical violin technique is precise, trained, restrained. The Appalachian fiddle style was raw and driving and rhythmic, optimized for dancing rather than concert halls. The bowing patterns, the ornamentation, the tunings, all of it developed distinctly in the mountains, away from formal musical instruction into something that had its own character. The banjo arrived from a completely different direction. Its ancestor instruments were brought to America by enslaved Africans. Instruments like the West African akonting, a hide-covered gourd instrument with a long neck and strings, which shared fundamental structural principles with what the banjo would eventually become. The five-string banjo as we recognize it today was developed in America in the mid-19th century, but the techniques and sensibility that drove its playing had roots in African musical tradition. The cross-cultural exchange of musical ideas that happened in the rural South, even in the context of the profound injustice and brutality of slavery and its aftermath, was one of the foundational forces that shaped everything that would eventually become country music. Historians still argue about the nature and extent of this cross-cultural exchange, specifically whether it was truly bidirectional or whether the dominant cultural forces consistently appropriated from African American traditions while offering little in return. The honest answer is that both things were happening simultaneously. White musicians in Appalachia were absorbing the rhythmic sensibility and emotional directness of African American music, and the music they played became something neither purely European nor purely African, but specifically unrepeatable American. The blues' influence on early country music is not a footnote. It is structural. There's also a quirky detail in the early history of country music that doesn't get mentioned often enough: the Hawaiian steel guitar. In the early 20th century, there was a nationwide craze for Hawaiian music in America. Hawaiian performers toured widely. Hawaiian-themed songs were popular in vaudeville, and the distinctive sound of the steel guitar played with a sliding bar, producing that swooping, gliding, almost vocal sound, captured the American imagination. Rural Southern musicians heard it and adopted it almost immediately. The steel guitar moved from Hawaiian music into country music with remarkable speed in the 1920s and 1930s, and it became, and has stayed, one of the most defining sounds of the genre. The crying, swooping notes of a pedal steel guitar, that sound that seems to physically reach inside your chest and rearrange something, arrived in country music by way of Honolulu. Which is not the most predictable origin story, but there it is. The mandolin, which came from Italian folk music traditions, was another instrument that found its way into Appalachian string bands by a circuitous route. Italian immigrants in the late 19th century brought mandolins to America. They became broadly fashionable as parlor instruments, and from there they drifted into rural Southern music where they fit naturally alongside fiddles and banjos. By the early 20th century, when music scholars and folklorists were first documenting what would become country music, The typical string band might include fiddle, banjo, guitar, and mandolin. Instruments from Africa, Europe, and the Pacific Islands, all playing together on a porch in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The recording industry discovered country music, which at the time was still being called hillbilly music, in the early 1920s. And the discovery was something of an accident. The story usually told is that in 1923, a record company talent scout named Ralph Peer recorded a fiddle player named Fiddlin' John Carson for the OK label in Atlanta, Georgia. Carson was already known locally, already beloved by the people who came to hear him play. Peer, by his own account, didn't think much of the recording. He considered it pluperfect awful. But the copies they pressed sold so fast and so immediately that the company was back for more within weeks. The audience was out there. It was enormous, and nobody had been selling to it. What followed was a gold rush. Record companies started sending talent scouts into the rural South, setting up makeshift recording sessions in hotel rooms and warehouses with portable equipment, looking for performers who had that quality that recording technology could capture and put onto a 7/8 RPM disc and sell to the millions of people who had apparently been waiting for someone to notice they existed. The most famous of these early field recordings happened in Bristol, Tennessee, and Virginia in the summer of 1927. A Victor Records talent scout and producer named Ralph Peer, same man, set up a temporary recording studio in a building on State Street, which runs along the Tennessee-Virginia border, and advertised for local musicians. What he found over those 2 weeks of sessions in Bristol has been called the Big Bang of country music, because the musicians who recorded there included two acts that would define the genre for the next century. One was a 35-year-old working railway mail clerk with tuberculosis who played guitar and yodeled and sang with a kind of aching, restless longing that felt like something new in the world. And his name, which we're keeping relatively light on here as promised, isn't what matters so much as what his music did. What it did was bring the blues into country music in a way that was explicit and unashamed, that borrowed directly from the African-American musical tradition and made something that felt genuinely free. The other act was a family group from southwestern Virginia, a husband, his wife, and his sister-in-law, who played and sang harmony with a precision and rootedness that felt like everything solid and sustaining about rural life made audible. Their songs came from old ballads, from gospel, from the hymns and folk traditions of the mountains. The energy was completely different from the yodeling, roaming rail worker, where his music moved outward, restlessly. Their music felt like staying in place, like the warmth of a kitchen, like something you could count on. Those two impulses, the restless and the rooted, the longing and the belonging, have been in productive tension inside country music ever since.
Every time the genre reinvents itself, you can find both of them in whatever new form emerges. Historians still argue about whether the Bristol sessions were truly the origin point of commercial country music, or whether they simply happened to be unusually well documented compared to the many other recording sessions that were happening during the same period across the South. The debate is partly semantic, what counts as an origin, but it touches on a real question about whether history is shaped by singular decisive moments or by the slow accumulation of 1,000 smaller ones. In country music's case, it was probably both. What is not debatable is that by the late 1920s, something recognizable as the early form of country music had been captured on disc and was being sold to an audience that proved far larger than the record industry had expected. People were buying these records in numbers that surprised everyone. It turned out that the music people made in the hollows and on the porches and at the barn dances was not parochial at all. It was expressing something that a lot of people recognized. On November 28, 1925, a radio station in Nashville called WSM went on the air. It was owned by the National Life and Accident Insurance Company. The call letters stood for their company slogan, "We Shield Millions," which is a slightly ominous thing to name your radio station, but there it is. And it was broadcasting from the 5th floor of the company's office building in downtown Nashville. The station hired a program director named George D. Hey,
who had previously been the announcer for a popular show called the National Barn Dance on WLS in Chicago. Hay launched a similar program on WSM, initially called the WSM Barn Dance, on the night of November 28, 1925, featuring a 77-year-old fiddle player named Uncle Jimmy Thompson, who played for an hour straight while George Hay grinned behind the microphone. An immediate success, the show became a weekly Saturday night broadcast. Hay, who called himself the solemn old judge, had a vision for what this program should be, and his vision was deliberately, affectionately rural. He wanted old-time music. He wanted something that celebrated its origins. 2 years later, in December of 1927, something happened that gave the show its permanent name. The NBC network had just broadcast a segment of high-toned classical music. Walter Damrosch's Music Appreciation Hour, full of grand opera and orchestral refinement, and Hay came to the microphone immediately after and said, in what has become one of the most quoted sentences in American music history, "For the past hour, we have been listening to the music taken largely from the Grand Opera, but from now on, we will present the Grand Ole Opry." The crowd loved it. The name stuck, and the show that has since become the longest-running weekly radio program in the world was renamed in a single, perfectly timed moment of wit. The Grand Ole Opry, broadcasting from Nashville, Tennessee, did something that was genuinely transformative for country music. WSM was a powerful clear channel station, and by the 1930s it was broadcasting at 50,000 watts, reaching nearly 30 states on a clear Saturday night. That meant a working farmer in rural Arkansas could hear the same music as someone in downtown Nashville, could feel connected to a community of listeners he'd never meet, could hear performers he'd otherwise never have access to. Radio, in this era, was doing what the internet does now. It was collapsing distance and creating a shared cultural experience out of what had been dozens of isolated local traditions. The Opry grew, and as it grew, it became the thing that defined country music's institutional home. Nashville had not been, before the Opry, a music city in any meaningful sense. It was the capital of Tennessee, home to several universities known for its insurance industry. Not exactly a hotbed of artistic ferment. But as the Opry attracted performers, performers attracted record labels attracted publishers and promoters, and the whole infrastructure of the music business, and by the time Nashville was being called Music City, it had earned the name. The Opry moved to the historic Ryman Auditorium in 1943, a former religious meeting hall that turned out to have extraordinary acoustics, and for the next 31 years that building, which performers called the Mother Church of Country Music, not entirely as a joke, was the heart of it all. Here's the quirky detail that doesn't often get mentioned. The Opry's founding radio station, WSM, was launched to help a life insurance company sell policies to rural customers. The field agents would introduce themselves as being from the company that broadcasts the Grand Ole Opry, and apparently this opened more doors than any other sales pitch they had. Country music, from its very first institutional home, was being used to sell life insurance. There's a joke in there somewhere about the relationship between country music and mortality, but we'll let it breathe. By the 1930s, country music had an established format on radio and a growing commercial recording industry. But the country itself was falling apart, and the music that came out of the Depression years had the weight of that in every note. The Great Depression hit rural communities first and hardest. Farm prices had already been in decline through the 1920s, even as the urban economy boomed. When the stock market crash of 1929 accelerated an economic collapse that spread to every corner of the country, the rural South and the agricultural Midwest, the places where country music lived, were devastated. Drought turned the Great Plains into the Dust Bowl. Hundreds of thousands of families lost their land and their livelihoods and packed into cars and trucks and drove west toward California with everything they owned, looking for something. The music that emerged from this experience was not, in the main, protest music. It wasn't political in the explicit sense, but it was honest about hardship in a way that few other popular forms were willing to be. Country music in the Depression era talked about poverty and displacement and loss without dressing them up. It talked about the people who were living through these things because those were the people making and listening to it. The songs from this period have an emotional specificity to them. Specific jobs, specific places, specific kinds of struggle that reads now as documentary. It was also in the 1930s that Western music entered the picture in a big way and started to shape what country and Western would eventually mean. The singing cowboy became a cultural phenomenon that was partly about the actual West and partly about a mythologized version of it that Americans needed in a difficult time. Films and radio programs romanticized the open range, the campfire, the lone rider with a horse, and a clear moral code. Singing cowboys became a commercial juggernaut. A remarkable number of those cowboy stars could carry a tune, and their songs about the West, with its themes of freedom and solitude and honest labor, sold enormously. Western swing arrived at the same time, and it was something else entirely. One of the most joyful, sophisticated, and hard to categorize things that has ever been called country music.
Out of Fort Worth, Texas, starting around 1930, a fusion was happening that brought together frontier fiddle music, Dixieland jazz, big band swing, blues, polka from German and Czech immigrant communities, mariachi from Mexican musical tradition, and Cajun influences from Louisiana, and mixed them into something that had an irresistible forward momentum. A band might have fiddles and guitars and steel guitar, but also trumpet and saxophone and drums, instruments that had never before been used in country music. The man most associated with Western swing, though historians still argue about whether he or his early collaborator Milton Brown deserves more credit as the genre's true originator, was a Texas fiddler and band leader who grew up near the heart of the area that produced some of America's greatest blues musicians. His band, Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys, performed weekly on a 50,000-watt radio station in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and during the late 1930s and 1940s, they were one of the most popular acts in America. Their music was optimized for dancing, driving, joyful, impossible to sit still during. And the dance halls they filled were themselves a response to the Depression, a place where people who didn't have much could spend very little and feel, for a few hours on a Friday night, like the world was generous and good. The humor in a lot of Western swing, the bandleaders hollering, the between-song banter, the sense that the whole thing was a long, lively conversation with the audience, was another kind of medicine for a hard time. Nobody could accuse Western swing of taking itself too seriously, which is part of why it still sounds so alive. The Second World War changed country music in ways that were impossible to fully predict. And the changes are fascinating because they push in completely opposite directions simultaneously. On one hand, the war uprooted millions of people from the rural communities where country music had lived, scattered them to military bases and war industry cities, mixed them with people from different regions and backgrounds. A soldier from rural Georgia might spend 2 years stationed with men from Texas and Tennessee and Oklahoma, sharing music across regional traditions, broadening what any individual thought of as country. Defense plants in Texas and California created instant boomtowns. The massive migration of Southwestern workers. Texans and Oklahomans and Arkansans who came to be called Okies, a term used dismissively that they eventually wore with pride, brought their musical traditions to California and found that the music they needed, the music that kept them connected to who they were, was being made in the roadhouses and honky-tonks that sprang up wherever these communities gathered. On the other hand, the war and its aftermath created a specific emotional landscape that fed directly into the birth of one of country music's most important and enduring subgenres, honky-tonk.
Honky-tonks were bars and roadhouses, common across Texas and Oklahoma, that had been around since at least the 1930s, when the repeal of Prohibition opened legal drinking back up, and hundreds of musicians found employment in places where people went to drink beer and dance, and, as one description from the era puts it, engage in hell-raising. These were not genteel establishments. They were small, loud, functional, lit more by neon signs than anything tasteful, with a wooden dance floor in the middle and a bar along one wall and a stage just big enough for a band in the back corner. The music had to compete with the noise of the crowd, which meant acoustic instruments were basically useless. Electricity was, as one musician put it decades later, your friend in a honky-tonk. So the amplified electric guitar moved into country music through the honky-tonk, and with it came something that changed the emotional vocabulary of the genre forever: the pedal steel guitar. The predecessor instrument, the lap steel, had already been in country music since the Hawaiian craze of the early 20th century. Remember that, from Section 2, the whole Hawaiian connection. The pedal steel, which developed in the late 1940s and early 1950s, added foot pedals and knee levers that allowed the player to change pitch dynamically while playing, creating those characteristic bends and glides and vibrato swells that sound more than almost anything else in music, like a human voice crying. The honky-tonk sound that crystallized in the late 1940s and reached its golden age in the 1950s was direct, emotionally raw, and lyrically unflinching about the realities of working-class life. Heartbreak and infidelity and drinking and dancing and all the things that people actually do when they're struggling and lonely. It was the opposite of polished. It was also the opposite of false. The audience recognized themselves in it. Here's your reality check for this evening, delivered with complete affection. If you had been a honky-tonk musician trying to build a career in the late 1940s Texas Roadhouse circuit, playing 6 nights a week in loud, smoky, frequently combative venues for whatever the hat could collect, while also dealing with the complete absence of reliable recording contracts or radio play, or anything resembling job security, performing for audiences who might turn the night interesting, at any moment, for any reason, you would almost certainly not survive this career with your health or your finances or your marriage intact. The casualty rate among honky-tonk musicians was genuinely extraordinary. The lifestyle, as documented by anyone who lived it, was roughly equivalent to volunteering for active combat duty, except the enemy was mainly the touring schedule and the bar tab. Most people did not last. The ones who did made some of the most extraordinary music in American history. The honky-tonk era produced a small number of towering figures whose influence on everything that followed is structural. One of them, and we're keeping names relatively light as promised, so let's call him the hillbilly Shakespeare, which is what they actually called him, was an Alabama-born singer and songwriter who had a gift for emotional honesty in songwriting that was almost uncomfortably direct. He wrote from his own life, which was by all accounts chaotic and painful and full of the kinds of experiences that make for devastating 3-minute songs. His voice had a quality that is genuinely difficult to describe, a kind of plaintive, slightly nasal, absolutely committed delivery that made every word feel true. His songs about heartache and drinking and the working life and the sweet melancholy of things you can't get back are still being played. In every roadhouse, in every jukebox, in every collection of country music anywhere in the world. His contemporary, whom we'll call the Texas Troubadour, was the person who really established the commercial model of the honky-tonk sound. He had a massive hit in 1941 with a song about obsessive romantic worry that became, essentially, the template for an entire era of country songwriting. Ernest Tubb is his name, and we can mention it because you ought to know it even if we're not dwelling on it. The era also, and this is worth emphasizing, gave women in country music some of their first real commercial footholds. Before the 1950s, female performers in country music were relatively rare as lead artists. The honky-tonk era's frank subject matter, cheating, heartbreak, divorce, the reality of being on the wrong end of someone's bad choices, created a space for female voices to say things that hadn't been said before from a woman's perspective. The first genuinely successful solo female country artist built her career in the early 1950s with a song that was essentially a response to another honky-tonk hit, offering the wife's point of view on a situation that country music had mostly been presenting from the husband's side. That inversion was so novel that radio programmers thought it was too controversial to play. The audience disagreed enthusiastically. Historians still argue about whether the honky-tonk era represented country music's most authentic expression of its working-class origins, or whether the genre had already been somewhat shaped and simplified by commercial recording processes before the first honky-tonk record was ever made. What is not in dispute is that the music from this period has proven extraordinarily durable, emotionally. You can play a honky-tonk song from 1951 to someone who has never heard it before, and they will understand what it's doing within 30 seconds. The instruments deserve their own chapter, because country music's sound is inseparable from the specific voices of its instruments. And each one has a story that feeds back into the larger story of where this music came from and what it's trying to do. The fiddle is the oldest voice in the tradition, and the argument about whether to call it a fiddle or a violin is itself a window into the sociology of the genre. It is exactly the same instrument. The difference is entirely one of cultural ownership. A violin is played in an orchestra by someone who trained for years in a formal tradition. A fiddle is played in a barn, on a porch, in a roadhouse, by someone who learned from a family member, possibly by ear, definitely without a music stand. The Appalachian fiddle tradition developed its own ornamentation, its own bowing techniques, its own tunings that vary by region. Open tunings that allow droning, modal scales that produce that distinctive, slightly eerie sound that still echoes in Appalachian music today. When you hear a fiddle in a country song, you're hearing 3 centuries of oral transmission packed into a few bars. The banjo's journey from West Africa to the American South, to the Appalachian Mountains, to the Grand Ole Opry stage is one of the most remarkable migrations in music history. By the time it arrived in country music, it had been thoroughly Americanized. The 5-string banjo with its characteristic drone string, the frailing and clawhammer techniques developed in Southern folk tradition, eventually the 3-finger picking style that would define bluegrass. But the instrument's fundamental character, its brightness, its rhythmic drive, its insistence on participating in the conversation rather than sitting back, reflects something of its African origins that never fully disappeared. The acoustic guitar, which might seem like the most obvious instrument in country music, was actually relatively late to arrive in the Southern musical tradition. Guitars were expensive in the 19th century and less common in rural communities than fiddles or banjos. But as prices dropped in the early 20th century and the guitar became accessible to working-class musicians, it moved very quickly to the center of the tradition. The guitar is the workhorse, the instrument that holds the harmonic center, that provides the rhythm structure that everything else hangs from. The steel guitar, in its various forms, lap steel, resonator guitar or dobro, pedal steel, provides what you might call the emotional weather of country music. It is the instrument most responsible for that sensation of being in the presence of something genuinely felt. The pedal steel in particular is an extraordinarily complex machine. It has multiple necks, foot pedals, and knee levers that when operated together can produce pitch changes, microtonal bends, harmonics, and volume swells with a sophistication that rewards years of practice. Country Music Hall of Fame historian and writer Rich Kienzle once described the pedal steel as the most expressive instrument in American music. The argument is not unreasonable. And then there's the harmonica, the mandolin, the upright bass, the dobro, each with its own route into country music, each adding another color to a palette that was never as simple as people who haven't listened carefully assume. The instrumentation of country music tells you everything about its history. It is the sound of people borrowing from everyone they encountered, keeping what worked, and making something that is in no way purely anything, but is entirely American. By the late 1950s, something was threatening to do to country music, what country music would spend the rest of the century doing to itself. It was in danger of being replaced by a newer, louder, more exciting thing. Rock and roll arrived in the mid-1950s, and it hit the music industry like a freight train hitting a paper bag. Suddenly, the teenagers who had been buying country records were buying rock records instead. The charts shifted. The money followed the charts. And the people running country music's commercial infrastructure in Nashville faced a crisis. The music they were selling was losing its audience to a genre that had partly grown out of country music in the first place. Rockabilly, after all, was essentially what happened when young Southern musicians started playing country songs with blues, rhythms, and electricity turned all the way up, and they had to decide whether to fight or adapt. They adapted. Specifically, they created something called the Nashville sound, which was exactly as calculated as that phrase implies, and also, in its finest moments, as beautiful as anything the genre produced before or after. The architects of the Nashville sound were a small number of producers and studio musicians working on a street called Music Row, which by the late 1950s had become the center of the Nashville music industry. Two names dominate the history of this era: Chet Atkins, who ran RCA Victor's Nashville operations, and Owen Bradley, who produced for Decca. Both men were musicians of extraordinary skill in their own right, and both had the same insight. If you replace the rough, twangy elements of honky-tonk, the steel guitar, the fiddle, the nasal vocals, with smoother, more polished elements borrowed from mainstream pop music, string sections, background vocal choirs, mellow production, you could make country music that crossed over to the pop charts and sold to a national audience that wouldn't have touched traditional country. When asked what the Nashville sound was, Atkins famously reached into his pocket, rattled the coins there, and said, "That's what it is. It's the sound of money," which was honest, if not exactly poetic. What he was making was commercial and deliberate and proud of being both. He was, as he said, just trying to sell records. But what he and Bradley produced in those studios on Music Row, in RCA Studio B, and in Bradley's famous Quonset Hut studio was frequently gorgeous. The warm, intimate quality of those recordings, the tube microphones, the echo chambers, the unhurried tempos, gave the best Nashville sound records a quality that still holds up completely. The group of session musicians who played on almost every Nashville sound record was known as the Nashville A-Team, and they were extraordinary. Guitarist Grady Martin, pianist Floyd Kramer, whose slip-note piano style, bending between notes in a way that was almost vocal, became an instantly recognizable part of the sound. Drummer Buddy Harmon, bassist Bob Moore. These musicians could learn a new song quickly, play it with complete conviction, and move to the next session, sometimes 4 or 5 sessions in a single day. They were, in their way, as responsible for country music's sound as any individual performer. What Nashville gave up in the process of becoming commercially successful was some of the rawness that had been country music's most distinctive quality, and not everyone was happy about that. The response to the Nashville sound's polished pop crossover came from the most unlikely geography. The agricultural flatlands of Central California, in a city more famous for oil production than music, in a scene that emerged precisely because it was 2,000 miles from Nashville and couldn't be touched by what Nashville was doing. Bakersfield, California had received a massive influx of migrants from the Southwest during the Dust Bowl and Depression years of the 1930s. These were people from Oklahoma and Texas and Arkansas who came to California looking for work and found, along with the jobs in the agricultural fields and oil refineries, that they'd brought their music with them. The Bakersfield clubs and dance halls had a specific clientele: working people, migrants, people with strong opinions about what real country music sounded like. And the musicians who played for them understood that they weren't in Nashville and weren't trying to be. The Bakersfield sound, as it came to be called, was the anti-Nashville in almost every specific way. Where Nashville was polishing the steel guitar out of its records, Bakersfield turned the steel guitar up. Where Nashville was adding string sections and background choirs to soften the twang, Bakersfield was plugging Fender Telecasters, a flat, no-nonsense electric guitar that produced a bright, cutting tone perfect for cutting through a noisy dance hall, directly into amplifiers and letting them ring. The production was lean. The rhythm section had a defined backbeat. The vocals were delivered with a directness that didn't apologize for itself. Two figures dominated the Bakersfield sound, and both had life stories that fed directly into the music they made. One of them, Buck Owens, would score 15 consecutive #1 country singles between 1963 and 1967, which is the kind of record that makes you pause. That's 15 songs in a row, every single one the other. Merle Haggard had a backstory that included actual time served at San Quentin prison and a body of songwriting that drew on personal experience with incarceration, poverty, and the specific texture of working-class California life in a way that nothing else in country music at the time was doing. Historians still argue about whether the Bakersfield sound represented a genuine artistic rebellion against Nashville's commercialism, or whether it was simply a regional style that found national success partly through the narrative framing of being the outsider alternative. The distinction matters less than the music, which was and remains excellent. What is inarguable is that Bakersfield's influence spread. The Eagles absorbed it, the outlaw country movement drew from it, and a generation of musicians who wanted the real thing and not the polished thing had a model. The Telecaster, that flat slab of ash and maple, deserves particular credit here. It became the instrument that said, "I am not the Nashville sound," in the most audible possible way. Its tone is too direct, too bright, too insistent to get lost in strings and choirs. When you hear a Telecaster in a country song, the song is making a statement about its own lineage, and the statement is, "I come from the floor of a dance hall, not a recording studio with an orchestra section in the back." Nashville listened to the complaints about the Nashville sound and, as it would do repeatedly throughout the next several decades, began to shift. But not before producing one more era of polished, orchestrated country music that pushed even further toward mainstream pop. The countrypolitan era of the late 1960s and early 1970s. Countrypolitan, a portmanteau of country and cosmopolitan that tells you everything you need to know, was the Nashville sound with the pop influence turned up further and the country influence turned down correspondingly. Full orchestral arrangements. Lush string sections with real string players, not a synthesizer approximation. Background vocal choirs. Artists singing in ballad tempos with intimate, emotional delivery. The production was meant to be indistinguishable from mainstream pop radio, and in many cases it was. Countrypolitan records sold well and crossed over widely. And then, in the early 1970s, the rebellion came. It came from Texas, as so many things do.
The outlaw country movement was not a complicated philosophical position. It was a group of musicians who had been frustrated by Nashville's control over everything. The material they could record, the musicians they had to use, the way their albums were produced, the image they were expected to maintain, and who decided to exercise the creative control that rock artists had been taking for granted for a decade. The two central figures were musicians who had each spent years trying to make it within Nashville's system, finding varying success but never quite the freedom they wanted before leaving. One of them moved back to Texas, started performing with his own band instead of Nashville session musicians, and began producing records that sounded nothing like what Music Row was making. Records that drew on jazz and folk and blues and swing and anything else he felt like, with a narrative looseness and a lyrical sophistication that operated on its own terms. The other negotiated an unprecedented contract with his record label that gave him control over his own recording sessions and started making records that sounded like they'd been played by a road band in a bar, because they were. In 1976, their names appeared together on a compilation album called Wanted, The Outlaws, the first country album to be certified platinum, and the outlaw movement became an official commercial phenomenon. The album featured Waylon Jennings,
Willie Nelson, Jesse Coulter, and Tompall Glazer. The music was raw, personal, and wore its influences openly. There was honky-tonk in it, and Western swing, and the Bakersfield DNA, and folk music, and the singer-songwriter tradition that had come out of the 1960s. It sounded like freedom. What the outlaw movement really won, beyond the music, was the principle of artistic control. After the Outlaws proved that country artists could produce their own work, make their own creative decisions, and still sell records, Nashville began to accommodate that model. The stranglehold that had existed since the Nashville Sounds creation began to loosen, and that loosening made everything that came after possible. There's a quality in country music that you find in almost every era, from the earliest fiddle tunes on front porches to the polished production of modern pop country. And it's the quality that explains the music's persistent appeal better than any other single thing. It tells the truth about ordinary life. This might sound like a small thing. It isn't. The dominant mode of most popular music is aspiration. The suggestion that life can or should be more glamorous, more exciting, more beautiful than the life you're actually living. Country music does the opposite. It says, the life you are living, with its disappointments and its comfort and its small pleasures and its considerable pain, is worth singing about. It is, in fact, the only thing worth singing about. When a country song talks about losing a job, or getting a DUI, or loving someone who doesn't love you back, or missing a person who died, or being proud of where you came from, even when where you came from wasn't impressive by anyone's external standard. These are not subjects that most of the music industry was particularly interested in exploring in a serious way. Country music made them its entire subject matter and has never apologized for it. There is a psychological mechanism that researchers have studied in relation to why people enjoy sad music, and it has some relevance here. Listening to a song that articulates exactly what you're feeling, that names the thing you haven't been able to name, that says this is real and I know it's real because I felt it too, produces a specific kind of emotional relief. Not comfort in the sense of being told everything is fine. Comfort in the sense of not being alone. Country music's emotional directness serves this function for millions of people who feel it working on them every time they hear a song that seems to have been written specifically about their own life, by someone who was probably sitting at a truck stop in Amarillo, thinking about their own entirely different problems at the time. The storytelling in country music is also a major part of the appeal, and it's something that distinguishes the genre from most of what surrounds it. Country songs are frequently short stories, 3 to 4 minutes long, with characters and plots and emotional arcs. You meet someone in the first verse. Something happens in the second. By the chorus, you understand what it means. Some of the greatest country songs work exactly like the best short fiction. The ending recontextualizes everything that came before, and you feel the click of recognition as something you've heard 100 times suddenly shows you something you didn't see. The fiddle and the steel guitar and the banjo are doing emotional work in the storytelling, too. These instruments have spent decades being associated with specific feelings. The fiddle with joy and longing, the steel guitar with ache and loss, the banjo with energy and irreverence. When you hear those tones, before any lyrics have registered, your body already knows the emotional territory you've entered. It's Pavlovian in the best possible sense. Country music has built a vocabulary of sounds that conveys meaning instantly, and then uses that vocabulary with great intentionality. Historians still argue about whether country music's emotional effectiveness is the result of deliberate craft or a happy accident of the genre's working-class origins, where the lack of formal training produced a directness that more trained musicians might have polished away. The most sensible answer is probably that it started as an accident and continued as a choice once enough people figured out what it was doing and why it worked. The 1980s were complicated for country music in ways that feel familiar now, because the complications were specifically about identity and authenticity. the question of what country music was supposed to be and who it was supposed to be for. The late 1970s had seen the rise of something called urban cowboy country, named after a 1980 film that featured a mechanical bull, John Travolta, and a version of country music that had been smoothed and polished for a mainstream audience that wanted the cultural signifiers of country. Hats, boots, two-stepping, that southern drawl, without the rougher edges. This was Countrypolitan's direct descendant, and it sold very well for a few years before the fad faded and left country music looking somewhat embarrassed about what it had been wearing. In the mid-1980s, a countercurrent emerged that was called the New Traditionalist Movement, and it was essentially country music looking in the mirror and saying, "Let's go back to basics." A group of younger artists arrived who wanted to play traditional country. Honky-tonk structure, fiddle and steel guitar front and center, real storytelling, no orchestra sections. And they found an audience that was ready for it. These weren't people performing nostalgia exactly. They were making new music in an older style, and they were very good at it. The key figure in establishing the sonic template for the New Traditionalist Movement was a Texas singer with a warm, unflashy baritone and an absolutely precise sense of how to deliver a lyric who had been building his career methodically since the late 1970s. George Strait's name is one we can mention. He has had more #1 hit songs than any artist in the history of country music, which is a staggering achievement that doesn't quite land until you try to imagine what it means in practice. 51 #1 singles. He did that mostly by finding the most perfectly constructed traditional country songs and performing them with a restraint and sincerity that made them sound effortless. The Telecaster and the fiddle and the steel guitar were always there. The songs always told stories. The production was clean but never cold. The New Traditionalist wave created the infrastructure, the radio programmers, the labels, the audience base, for what came next, which was the single biggest commercial explosion in country music's history. The class of 1989, as it became known, was a generation of artists who arrived essentially simultaneously and transformed country music into something that had not existed before. A genuinely mass-market phenomenon that was also musically connected to its roots. Garth Brooks sold over 62 million albums in the United States during the 1990s, more than any American artist of that decade except Mariah Carey and Celine Dion. He achieved this by combining the musical vocabulary of neo-traditional country with the staging and energy of arena rock, building shows that were events in the way that stadium rock concerts were events, and filling venues that country music had never filled before. Country radio in the 1990s had the largest audience share and the most educated, highest income demographic of any radio format. The genre that had started on front porches in Appalachian hollows, been dismissed as hillbilly music, been recorded in hotel rooms, been played in oil field roadhouses, had become the most commercially dominant form of American popular music. That trajectory is still remarkable to contemplate. After the commercial explosion of the 1990s came a natural settling, and then something more interesting. A proliferation of country music streams that was unprecedented in the genre's history. The 2000s saw pop country consolidate its commercial dominance on country radio while simultaneously running parallel and often unacknowledged by the mainstream industry. A counter-movement called Americana or alt-country developed in venues and on smaller labels. Americana was hard to define precisely. It included singer-songwriters, bluegrass-influenced acts, artists who incorporated rock or folk or soul or gospel in various proportions. But it was identifiable by a shared commitment to the qualities that the genre's original creators had valued: emotional honesty, real instrumentation, storytelling that didn't over-explain itself. The tension between these two versions of country music, the polished, radio-friendly mainstream and the raw, roots-oriented alternative, is not new. It's the same tension that produced the Nashville sound and the Bakersfield sound simultaneously. It produced the Countrypolitan era and the outlaw response. Country music seems to need both currents. When it loses the tension between them and collapses entirely into one or the other, the results are less interesting. The 2010s brought a new conversation about who country music belonged to, one that was long overdue. The genre's commercial mainstream had for decades presented country music as specifically and almost exclusively white Southern music, which erased both the genre's actual history. Those West African banjo traditions, the blues influence that is structural rather than decorative, the documented cross-cultural musical exchange of the rural South, and the ongoing contributions of black country artists who had been making the music all along and receiving far less recognition for it than their white contemporaries. Charlie Pride, who became the first black solo artist to achieve major country stardom in the late 1960s, had navigated an era when radio stations sometimes refused to tell their audiences what race he was because they were afraid the information would cost him listeners. That he managed to build the career he did, with 29 #1 hits and a Grand Ole Opry membership that he retained for decades, is a testament to both his extraordinary talent and the specific contortions required of him. His story is one of the more uncomfortable chapters in country music's history, and it wasn't the last. The conversation about country music's roots and who those roots belong to, who gets credited, who gets radio play, who gets to call themselves country, has become more explicit in the past decade than at any previous point. Historians still argue about whether country music's future lies in returning to its multicultural roots or in embracing the pop crossover that makes it financially sustainable, but an increasing number of people in the genre are arguing that this is a false choice. The two things are not in opposition. They never were. We're getting close to the end of tonight's journey, and it feels right to spend a little time with what country music actually is, at its core. Not the genre label, not the instruments, not the subgenres, but the essential thing it's been trying to do for the full 100 years of its documented history. Country music is, first and last, a literature of ordinary life. It is a literature written for people who work with their hands, who drive long distances, who have complicated feelings about the places they come from, who love people who aren't always easy to love, who have lost things and kept going anyway. It is a literature that holds in high regard the specific and the concrete, not love in the abstract, but the particular way someone laughs, not loss in general, but the exact weight of a particular empty chair. This specificity is what gives country music its emotional grip. A lyric that names the thing precisely, that gives a familiar experience and exact articulation, does something to the listener that generality cannot. It says, I see you. I know what this costs. The best country songs are also, almost invariably, formally simple. Verse, chorus, bridge, 3 or 4 chords, direct language. This simplicity is not a limitation. It's a compression technique. Everything that doesn't belong is stripped away until what remains is just the core of the feeling, just the thing that needed to be said. A well-constructed country song is like a well-told joke in the sense that every word is doing work, and if you take one out, the whole thing loses its shape. The communal dimension of country music is something that gets talked about less than the emotional dimension, but matters just as much. This music was made to be shared. Fiddle tunes were made for dancing, not listening. The music existed in service of a physical, communal activity that gathered people together and let them move in synchrony. The barn dance, the honky-tonk floor, the stadium floor of a modern country concert. They're all versions of the same thing. A space where strangers can come together and be governed briefly by the same rhythm, the same lyric, the same feeling. There's a reason that country concerts have some of the most participatory audiences in live music. When 50,000 people in a stadium all know the words to the same song, and they do, they always do, every single word, something happens that is more than entertainment. It's a community ritual. The music provides the text that the community speaks aloud together. And in speaking it together, they are confirming something about shared values and shared experience and shared belonging. The genre will keep changing, as it always has. Pop country will get more poppy. Americana will keep pulling toward the roots. New voices will arrive from unexpected places and bring unexpected influences. The debate about authenticity, What counts as real country music and who gets to make it will continue, as it has since the very first recording of the very first hillbilly fiddle player, because the debate itself is part of the music's ongoing vitality. Dead genres don't argue about what they are. What will not change is the fundamental impulse. To make music that tells the truth about the life people are actually living. In language people can actually understand, with instruments that speak to something older and deeper than fashion or trend. That impulse was on the porch in Appalachia in 1750. It was in the Bristol hotel room in 1927. It was in the roadhouses of East Texas in 1943, and in RCA Studio B in 1959, and in Bakersfield in 1963, and in the Outlaws recording sessions in 1976, and in the stadiums of the 1990s. And it is, right now, in someone's living room or pickup truck or phone speaker or headphones. It is in the song that came on while you were having a hard week and said exactly what you couldn't say. That's what country music is. That's what it has always been. And that is, I think, more than enough reason to love it. If tonight's journey found you somewhere comfortable, if the history of all those fiddles and front porches and honky-tonks and recording studios kept you company while you drifted, then this is exactly where we were both supposed to end up. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Like the video if it found you well tonight, and subscribe if you want more nights like this one. New videos whenever the road takes us somewhere worth going. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where in the world people are listening from. As the music goes on, you don't need to follow anything anymore. The day has already passed. Slowly, quietly, just as it needed to. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to see. You can simply rest here, take a slow breath in, and gently let it go. And again, breathing in and out. You may notice how still everything feels now. The world around you has softened, the sounds have faded, and all that remains is a quiet sense of calm. You don't need to hold on to anything. You can let the day drift further away. Let each thought become lighter, less defined, until it no longer needs your attention. Your breathing continues, slow, steady, effortless, in and out. Your shoulders relax a little more. Your body feels heavier, more supported, as if it's gently sinking into rest. There's nothing you need to control, nothing you need to think about. Just this moment, soft, quiet, and still. If any thoughts come, you can let them pass, like distant movement, barely noticeable. They don't need to stay. They don't need to mean anything. They can simply fade. Your breathing becomes even slower now, in and out, and with each breath, you may feel yourself drifting a little further, a little deeper, into a calm, steady rest. There is no rush, no need to fall asleep. You can just rest here, quietly, and let sleep come when it's ready. The night continues around you, soft and still, nothing changing, nothing demanding, just the gentle rhythm of quiet, continuing without end. You may notice the silence now, not empty, just calm, steady, unbroken. And as you continue to breathe, slowly, gently, you can allow everything to soften just a little more. Your thoughts, your body, your awareness, until even the sense of listening begins to fade, and you are simply resting, drifting, letting go.